A routine traffic stop, or maybe something much more calculated. When two officers with a long history of questionable conduct decide they can bully and humiliate an elderly black man on a quiet country road, they think it'll be just another day, another name, another ticket buried in the system. But what they don't realize is this man isn't alone. His daughter isn't just any woman. She's a four-star general with the power, the resolve, and the truth on her side. What follows is a gripping battle between abuse of authority and unwavering courage, a collision of silence and accountability that will shake an entire town and expose something far bigger than a single traffic stop. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end because nothing about what happens next is predictable. So, before we dive in, let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. And if you believe in dignity, justice, and the power of standing up, go ahead and hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. This is a story that needs to be heard. On a quiet spring morning just outside Lancaster, Texas, the hum of tires on sun-warmed asphalt broke the stillness of the backroads as Walter Jenkins drove his old 1966 Chevy pickup like he had for decades, steadily, deliberately, as if the road itself remembered him. The truck wasn't pretty by any stretch. Patches of rust around the wheel wells, a cracked windshield with a single stubborn wiper, and a muffler that grumbled low like an old man clearing his throat before speaking. But to Walter, it wasn't just a truck. It was a memory on wheels, the last machine he had rebuilt with his own hands after retiring from the railroad yard nearly 30 years ago, and the last thing his wife ever rode in before she passed. The bench in the truck bed had taken him nearly 6 weeks to finish, carved from reclaimed cypress and sanded so smooth his fingers could glide across it without catching. He had inlaid their initials W and L in a simple heart design beneath the armrest, subtle, private, just the way she would have liked it. He wasn't a man for displays of sentiment, but this bench wasn't for anyone else to see. It was for Lillian. For her birthday. He whispered to himself as he drove. She always did like to sit in the shade when the azaleas bloomed. His voice cracked only slightly, but he didn't stop to clear it. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept his eyes on the gravel road that wound through farmland and over dry creek beds, knowing every turn like the lines in his palm. The town had changed, though. Fewer mailboxes now, more for sale signs. The Jenkins place used to be surrounded by families who'd gather on porches, wave. As he drove by, ask after his daughter Camille. Now it felt like the land was holding its breath waiting. They'd called it progress, what happened to Lancaster. New developments, new zoning, new faces in old places. But Walter had watched that kind of progress before. He saw how it stripped away, not just homes, but the people who made them meaningful. Still, he'd stayed. Not out of stubbornness, but because some things he believed deserved to endure. His hands knotted with age, and decades of use rested calmly on the wheel, but his mind was elsewhere on Camille, his only child who would be flying in tomorrow from D.C. She had always been headstrong, even as a little girl. "I'm gonna fly jets like in the movies," she'd said once, barely 10, standing in the middle of the yard with her arms out like wings. And she did, only she didn't just fly them. She commanded squadrons, then divisions, and eventually entire regions. Now she wore 4 stars on her shoulder and could get the president on the line faster than most governors. But to Walter, she was still that little girl who used to hand him tools while he worked under the truck, asking too many questions and never taking no for an answer. He adjusted his mirror and caught sight of himself, deep creases around his eyes, a gray beard that needed trimming, and a VA-issued baseball cap perched above his brow. The cap said Korean War veteran, but he didn't wear it for attention. It was just a part of him now, like the limp in his right leg or the memory of men who never came home. A sudden gust pushed dust across the road, and he slowed, instinctively easing the truck to a near crawl as he passed the remnants of a field once planted with sweet corn. The bench in the back shifted slightly, its blanket wrapping tugged by the wind, and Walter pulled over for a moment to adjust the tie-down straps. His knees cracked as he stepped out, but he didn't rush. He moved like someone who knew the cost of haste. While tightening the last strap, he glanced up at the sky, clear, wide, and endless. "Almost there, Lil," he said softly. He stood there for a long second, just breathing, letting the warm air settle around him. The birds were quiet, the wind had stilled, and the road ahead curved toward the cemetery just 3 miles out. He climbed back into the driver's seat, adjusted his mirror again, and turned the key. The engine responded with a reluctant cough, then settled into its usual low growl. He was about to pull back onto the road when he noticed a dust trail coming from the opposite direction. A county patrol car. He didn't think much of it. He wasn't speeding, his plates were up to date, and he always checked his lights before a drive. But something in his chest tightened anyway, just a little. Not fear exactly. More like the memory of fear. He exhaled slowly as the cruiser passed him, then saw the red and blue lights flare in his mirror. He sighed. Pulling off again to the shoulder, Walter put the truck in park, both hands resting plainly on the wheel. That was how he'd always done it, visible, calm, cooperative. The rules weren't written for men like him, not when he was young and not now, but he knew them by heart. The cruiser door opened, and a young officer stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses with an exaggerated slowness. Another door opened on the passenger side. 2 deputies for 1 old man. Walter didn't move. His eyes followed their approach, his posture straight still. The air had shifted. There was something sharp in it now, like ozone before a storm. He could hear the gravel crunching beneath their boots, the low hum of his truck's engine, and the faint creak of the bench ropes in the back. And beneath it all, a quiet thrum in his chest, steady but growing. Not from panic, from clarity. Because he knew, though he didn't know why or how, that this stop would not be routine, not today. And as he sat there, the sun edging higher behind him and the weight of years pressing gently on his shoulders, Walter Jenkins prepared to meet whatever was coming, the only way he ever had, head high, voice steady, and dignity unshaken. He thought of Lillian and the bench waiting to be delivered to her resting place of Camille, and the long road she'd taken to where she was now, and of the land behind him that had tried to change but never fully succeeded in pushing him out. Whatever this was, it would pass too, or so he believed, until the first voice broke through the silence with clipped authority, license and registration, step out of the vehicle. And in that moment, the warm morning air seemed to still completely, like the world itself was holding its breath. Walter didn't ask any questions at first, not because he wasn't confused, but because he had learned long ago that asking the wrong question or asking it in the wrong tone could lead to consequences that had nothing to do with justice. Instead, he lowered his window slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements the way experience had trained him, and turned his head just enough to meet the eyes of the young deputy standing outside the truck. The man looked barely 30 pale under the brim of his tan campaign hat, mirrored sunglasses hiding his expression, hand already resting casually near the grip of his holstered weapon like muscle memory had brought it there. License and registration, the deputy repeated this time with less bark but no more civility. Walter nodded once calmly. "It's in my wallet, officer. May I reach for it?" The deputy gave a small shrug that might have meant yes or nothing at all. Walter moved slowly, deliberately lifting one hand from the wheel, reaching into the inside pocket of his worn canvas jacket, and pulling out a faded leather wallet that had held up through 30 years of sweat, sawdust, and slow Sundays. He passed over his license and registration without a word, then returned his hands to the wheel where they rested with practiced patience. The deputy took the papers and stepped back without so much as a thank you. The second officer had approached by then, taller, broader face, half-shadowed by the rising sun, his gaze not on Walter but scanning the truck bed like he was casing a crime scene. Walter could feel the shift in atmosphere, the way an old farmer feels a storm brewing subtle electric, and pressing down with a heaviness that made the air feel thicker than it should have been. "What's in the back?" the second deputy asked, not accusing yet, but not curious either. "A bench," Walter answered plainly. "Handmade. I'm delivering it to the cemetery just outside town." The 2 men exchanged a glance, brief but clear enough. The first one scoffed softly. "Cemetery, huh?" Then he added almost under his breath, "That explains the smell." Walter heard it, but he didn't rise to it. He kept his eyes forward, breathing slow through his nose, remembering how many times he'd taught Camille to stay calm in the face of ignorance, though now it struck him as both bitter and strange that his daughter could command drone strikes from halfway around the world, but he still had to justify a carved piece of furniture in the bed of a truck. "You got any proof that's yours?" the second deputy asked, thumb hooking onto his belt. Walter blinked. "The bench? Yeah, the bench. I built it myself," he said. "The tools are behind the cab. You can check the toolbox if you want, but I'd prefer you didn't touch the bench. It's for my wife." The first deputy, who had returned from his cruiser with something scribbled on a notepad, raised an eyebrow. "That your wife in the truck too?" He gave a small laugh at his own joke, as though he were the only one who understood how clever he was. Walter turned his head just slightly. "She passed," he said softly. "3 years ago tomorrow." For a moment, nothing happened. A dry breeze swept across the road, rustling the roadside weeds and lifting dust around the deputy's boots. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called out from an old fence post. Then, without warning, the taller deputy stepped closer and said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to exit the vehicle." Walter looked at him fully for the first time. "On what grounds, officer?" "Suspicion of transporting unregistered goods and possible theft." Walter blinked again, slower this time. "Theft of what?" "We'll let you know once we take a look," the deputy replied, already reaching for the door handle. Walter unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, wincing slightly as his knees adjusted to the weight of his body. He stood straight, arms at his sides, not resisting but not retreating either. He watched as the deputy walked past him and opened the tailgate without permission, lifting the edge of the tarp, covering the bench, exposing the polished cypress wood and the soft curve of the carved armrests. "Pretty fancy for a backyard project," the deputy muttered, running a gloved finger along the grain. "You sure this ain't stolen?" "I've been working wood longer than you've been alive," Walter said, his voice flat even. "Check the underside of the armrest. It's got my initials, WJ, burned in by hand." The deputy crouched, pretending to check, then stood without comment. The other one, the talker, was now rifling through the old green toolbox, mounted behind the cab, pulling out hammers, a measuring square, a coiled tape reel, and tossing them onto the side of the road with what felt like intentional clumsiness. Walter clenched his jaw but said nothing. Not yet. His tools landed in the dirt like fallen bones. The same tools he'd used to build cabinets in their old home, to make Camille's first rocking horse, to carve the porch swing. Lillian had insisted on keeping, even after the chain rusted through, and it dropped her like a trapdoor one summer. "Evening." "Sir, step over here," one of them said, gesturing to the gravel shoulder beside the truck. Walter obeyed, though his body moved slower now, wearier not from age, but from the knowledge that nothing he could say would alter what was already in motion. One of the deputies circled the truck again, looking under the chassis, tapping along the fenders, like he was auditioning for some backwoods security theater. Without a word, they began pulling apart the bench, lifting the seat lid, inspecting underneath. When the older deputy, the talker, found a small wooden compartment where Walter had stored a folded military flag, some faded photos, and a metal box tied shut with string, he grinned like he'd caught something alive. "What's this?" "Memories," Walter answered, eyes steady. "Looks like a stash box to me." He tugged the string loose and dumped the contents onto the ground. The metal silver, dulled with age, hit the gravel with a clink that made Walter flinch like he'd been struck. He didn't speak. Not then. Not when they kicked the box aside, not when they stepped on a photo that showed him at age 23, standing next to a helicopter in Daegu, South Korea. The silence wasn't consent. It was containment. His hands balled loosely into fists, then unclenched. He counted backwards in his head like he'd done in the VA waiting rooms, like he'd done when the arthritis flared and he refused to cry out. "You always this quiet?" one of them asked. "Only when I'm being talked at, not spoken to," Walter replied. They didn't like that. But they didn't say it. Instead, the taller deputy picked up the bench one side only awkwardly and let it drop back into the truck bed with a loud crack as one of the legs splintered near the joint. Walter's face didn't change, but his breath caught in his chest. "Oops," the deputy said with a smirk. "Guess it wasn't as solid as you claimed." Walter stepped closer, not aggressive, just present. "That wasn't yours to touch," he said, quiet but firm. "You had no cause." "You want to make this harder, sir," the deputy said suddenly, stepping forward, chest puff. "No," Walter said, meeting his gaze. "I want you to remember this moment." The younger officer scoffed. "Remember what?" Walter looked down at the scattered pieces of his life, the torn bench, the tarnished metal in the dust, the photo bent at the corner, and said, "What it looks like when you stop seeing people and start seeing problems." Then he turned away, walked back to the driver's side door, and stood quietly beside it, not asking to get back in, not trying to drive off, just waiting. Steady. Dignified. The weight of years pressing into his back, the bench no longer intact behind him, and the road ahead still stretching wide and long, but now with something changed in the air. Inside the Pentagon's West Wing, where the corridors stretch long and silent, and every word spoken echoes against concrete and consequence. General Camille Jenkins sat motionless in a leather-backed chair, her posture perfect, her fingers, laced lightly on the polished table in front of her. The room around her was filled with high-ranking officials and aides, laptops, open files, thick with foreign intelligence briefings, drone footage, and geopolitical forecasts. But she wasn't looking at any of them. Her eyes were locked on a small blinking icon on the face of her smartwatch, a subtle blue pulse that most people in that room wouldn't have recognized for what it was. She had designed the system herself years ago quietly, during a lull between deployments, a private failsafe linked to only one person in the world, her father. A secure medical bracelet with a pressure sensor embedded in the underside, something she'd insisted he wear after his second fall in the garden, though she had never told him about the deeper layers it activated. He thought it just called EMS. He didn't know it, also reached her. The pulse had come in exactly 4 minutes ago, and Camille hadn't moved a muscle since. Not out of shock, but calculation. She had learned early in her career that visible emotion was a luxury few women in uniform could afford, and none who looked like her ever got to indulge. Still beneath her composed surface, her stomach had clenched with a tight, specific kind of dread, the kind that came not from injury or illness but from something more insidious, something human. General Jenkins, the deputy director of operations, said from across the table, gesturing to the folder before him. "Do you concur with the satellite intercept schedule?" Camille blinked once, refocusing just enough to answer without hesitation. "Push to 0800 Zulu and prioritize the coastal lanes. Any later and we lose our advantage." There was a chorus of nods, pens, scratching paper keyboards, clicking softly like distant rain, and Camille stood without ceremony, gathering her file, as if she were heading to another meeting. Only her aide, Captain Reyes, noticed the sudden shift in her energy, the precision of her movements tightening, as if every second had become more valuable than the last. Once outside the room, she walked briskly down the hall, her heels echoing across the marble like a metronome for urgency. "Ma'am," Reyes asked, falling into step beside her, concern shadowing her features. Camille didn't slow. "I need transport on the tarmac in 15 minutes, she said evenly. "Clear it through General Stroud. No questions, no delays." Reyes hesitated only a moment. "Is this a classified mobilization?" Camille stopped short, turned to face her, and for a brief instant the shield dropped. "It's my father." That was all she said. No explanation, no backstory. And yet somehow Reyes understood it was the only answer necessary. Outside, the wind whipped low across the airfield, hot and dry, even in spring, stirring the flag on the hangar roof into a slow, restless ripple. Camille boarded the blacked-out SUV that would take her to the airstrip without speaking to anyone else. As the door closed behind her, she let herself exhale a single breath that felt heavier than any she'd taken in months. In the darkened cabin, she tapped her watch again, opening the secure channel that would show her the bracelet's last GPS ping. The coordinates blinked on-screen: rural central Texas, just outside Lancaster. Her father's truck hadn't moved in 37 minutes. The signal was still active but static, as if the device had been pressed once and then left untouched. That wasn't like him. He was meticulous, deliberate, measured. He didn't panic, which meant something or someone had stopped him from doing anything else. She rubbed her thumb along the edge of the tablet in her lap, forcing herself not to imagine the worst. He had survived a war, buried a wife, and raised her on a pension check and carpentry commissions. He was not fragile, even at his age. But she also knew exactly how fragile the world could become when power met prejudice in the wrong hands. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, picturing him behind the wheel of that old Chevy pickup, humming gospel under his breath, like he always did when he was nervous but didn't want to show it. He had told her once years ago, sometimes silence is the loudest form of resistance, and she had never forgotten it, even when she was shouting orders across a flight deck or testifying before Congress. The vehicle jolted slightly as it hit a rough patch of road, and she opened her eyes again, steady now, focused. She opened a comms channel to Westland Air Command. "This is General Jenkins. I'm requesting real-time satellite visuals on grid sector Delta 905 radius 1 mile. Civilian traffic analysis. Begin playback from timestamp 0843. The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am. Confirming authentication. Data stream in progress." Within seconds, grainy footage filled the tablet screen. Cars crawling along rural roads, dust kicking up behind them, birds startled from telephone wires. She tapped to zoom in on a particular intersection, pausing when she saw the unmistakable profile of her father's truck pulled to the shoulder, two police cruisers parked at angles behind it. Figures moved around the truck, small at this resolution but unmistakable in posture. One man, tall, squared shoulders, stood over a hunched figure that she didn't need detail to recognize. Walter Jenkins. The SUV came to a halt on the tarmac, the jet waiting ahead with stairs lowered and engines humming at idle. Camille stepped out into the wind, her uniform pressed crisp against her frame, her cap pulled down low over her brow. She didn't look back. From the first time she'd stood at attention as a cadet, through 30 years of war rooms, deployments, and policy summits, Camille Jenkins had always believed in the strength of the system, flawed but correctable, slow but steady. But now, as she climbed the aircraft steps and felt the thrum of engines beneath her feet, she understood something else. Sometimes the system doesn't break. Sometimes it works exactly the way it was built to fail the ones who can't fight back. As the cabin door sealed shut behind her and the jet began to roll toward the runway, she opened the satellite footage one last time. The frame paused on her father's truck, still there, still surrounded, still waiting. She looked at his figure frozen in time and felt a calm, cold resolve settle over her. They didn't know who they'd stopped, but they would, very soon. Walter stood quietly beside his truck boots, planted firm on the dusty roadside, his posture betraying none of the storm brewing behind his calm eyes. The bench, his offering of love and memory, now lay lopsided in the bed of the truck, its rear leg cracked from careless handling, and his tools scattered in the dirt gleamed faintly in the late morning sun like abandoned instruments after an Anderdatheim unfinished performance. Around him the deputies moved with a strange sense of authority, not frantic, not aggressive, just deliberate, in a way that told him this wasn't their first time treating someone like this, not like a man, but like a nuisance to be managed. Dismissed. They didn't speak to him anymore, only about him, and even then, their words were thinly veiled barbs, disguised as official language phrases, like potential non-compliance, suspicious behavior, and verifying statements thrown around like ash from a burning structure. Walter noticed the change. Before he saw it, a shift in the air's pressure, a collective turning of heads, a silence that spread through the bystanders like ink in still water. What began as one or two murmurs from a couple across the street, curious glances, phones raised discreetly, had now become a small crowd gathering near the edge of the road, some stepping off porches, others parking and walking up slowly, their expressions mixed with confusion, concern, and something else he knew too well, the practiced hesitation of people who had seen too much to assume the best. A teenage boy, 16, maybe with shaggy hair and a phone held tightly in his hand, stood just behind the fence, recording everything without blinking. A woman in scrubs clutched her keys in one hand and her tote bag in the other, frozen halfway toward her car, lips parted, as if she'd meant to say something but thought better of it. An older man leaned against a mailbox post, arms crossed, his face hard to read but his eyes sharp. And through it all, Walter remained still aware of the weight of being watched, the burden of standing under a gaze that could either protect or condemn depending on what came next. One of the deputies noticed the crowd too. "We've got an audience," he muttered to the other, a note of annoyance creeping into his voice. "They can watch all they want," the other said flatly, flicking a citation pad from his belt. "He's getting fined for obstruction and unsecured cargo at minimum. We don't need consent when there's probable cause." Walter turned his head slowly. "And what exactly was your probable cause?" "Your tone's close to crossing a line, old man," came, the reply sharp and practiced as though it had been said before in other towns to other men who looked like him. Walter didn't flinch. "No, officer. My tone is exactly where it should be. Yours might need adjusting." The deputy stepped closer, just half a pace, but the motion said enough. The tension snapped taut, like a rope pulled too tight between restraint and reaction. Then came the sound, not a command, not a shout, but a soft chime. Walter's phone was ringing. He moved slowly, deliberately, glancing toward his pocket, then toward the deputy, for nonverbal permission. The man nodded reluctantly, but his eyes narrowed. Walter pulled the phone from his coat, checked the screen, and saw her name, Camille. The knot in his chest loosened for a split second. He answered, voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "Hey, sweetheart. Yes, I'm still on the way. I've just been stopped. No, nothing serious, just a misunderstanding about a taillight." There was a pause. He listened, and then his voice dropped just slightly. No need to come out here. I'll be along shortly. Don't you worry. The deputy reached out and snatched the phone from his hand. Who is this? He asked into the receiver, his tone shifting the smirk, replaced with something harder to define, curiosity mixed with challenge. He didn't say much, just listened for a few beats, then his eyebrows twitched downward. Your father's been stopped for multiple violations, he said. He'll be a while. You can wait or come get whatever this bench is supposed to be. Then, without waiting for a response, he ended the call and tossed the phone back toward Walter, who caught it with both hands. That single moment, small, seemingly insignificant, was witnessed by every person watching. A veteran, a craftsman, a father, treated like a child whose voice carried no weight. The deputy scribbled rapidly in his book. Broken taillight, unsecured load failure to comply with lawful orders, possible contraband. There is no contraband, Walter said, his voice firmer now. Just wood and memory. Talking back's another one, the deputy added, tearing the tickets from the pad and thrusting them forward. Walter took them, hands calm but clenched just enough to betray the tension beneath his weathered skin. The fine totaled $1,200, might as well have been $12,000. He glanced toward the scattered tools, the broken bench, the silent faces in the growing crowd. You'll need to clean up this mess before you leave, one officer said. Or call that daughter of yours to come handle it. The insult didn't sting. He had grown thick-skinned long ago, but something about the way it was said, that tone of casual disrespect, left a taste in his mouth he couldn't swallow down. He bent down slowly, one knee cracking under his weight, and began collecting his tools one by one. His hands moved with care, wiping the dirt from each item before setting it gently back in the bed of the truck, as though he were handling relics from a time when effort still earned respect. As he reached for the broken leg of the bench, a gust of wind swept across the road, sending dust into his eyes, and he blinked hard against the sting. The sound of car doors closing behind him told him the deputies were finished, returning to their cruiser with the confidence of men who believed there would be no consequences for what they'd just done. And maybe Walter thought they were right. Maybe this was just how it went now. He looked up briefly and caught the eye of the boy behind the fence phone, still recording, expression serious now, no longer just curious. Walter gave him the smallest of nods, not a thank you, not a plea, just a gesture that said, I see you seeing me, asterisk. Then he stood slowly, joints, aching, pride intact, surrounded by cracked wood and tarnished metal. The crowd hadn't moved. No one cheered. No one shouted. But in their silence he felt something stir, not pity, not outrage, but recognition. And as Walter Jenkins straightened his back against the weight of the day, he understood that dignity doesn't come from how others treat you. It comes from how you choose to stand anyway. The gravel crunched softly beneath the tires as the black SUV approached its matte finish, muted against the bright Texas sun, moving slow and steady, like something with purpose far deeper than urgency. It stopped 20 feet behind Walter's battered pickup, the engine cutting out with a low sigh, and for a moment, the only sounds were the dry rustle of wind across prairie grass and the restless shifting of onlookers who still lingered nearby, unsure of what they were about to witness. The air, already charged from the earlier tension, now carried a different kind of weight, quieter but sharper, as though the world itself had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The front passenger door opened first, revealing a uniformed military driver who stepped out and stood crisply at attention, eyes forward, posture locked in that unmistakable stance of someone trained to wait in silence. Then, with the elegance of someone for whom every motion had been refined through years of ritual and discipline, the rear door swung open and out stepped General Camille Jenkins. Her boots touched Texas soil like they were returning to claim something, not territory, not pride, but truth. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't need to. The 4 silver stars on her shoulders glinted in the light, and those standing nearby instinctively shifted, not out of fear, but respect, born of presence. She stood still for a moment, allowing herself a full breath, taking in the scene with eyes that had scanned war zones and intelligence briefings and diplomatic rooms filled with old men who'd underestimated her more than once. Her gaze moved from the scattered tools in the dirt to the broken bench leg poking awkwardly from the truck bed, then to her father, stoic, composed but unmistakably worn in a way she hadn't seen before. He was still crouched by the tailgate, picking up screws with fingers that had once carved rocking horses from scrap oak, each movement deliberate and dignified. She walked toward him without rushing, without hesitation, her uniform catching the breeze like a banner on a still battlefield. "Dad," she said softly when she reached him, her voice lowered just enough for his ears alone. Walter looked up, shielding his eyes with one hand, a flicker of surprise, then concern crossing his features. "Camille, what on earth are you doing here?" "I got your alert," she replied. "I came." He stood up slowly, his joints stiff, his breath shallow, brushing dust from his knees as if to regain some lost formality. "I didn't want to worry you," he muttered. "It's just a thing that got out of hand." She looked at him steady and clear. "This is not just a thing, Dad." Behind her, the deputies had started to notice. One of them stepped away from their cruiser brows, furrowed mouth tightening, as recognition began to register, not of who she was exactly, but of what she represented. The uniform, the stars, the silence that had fallen across the crowd like a curtain dropping before a final act. Camille turned slightly, her voice carrying now cool and even but unmistakably firm. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone devoid of heat but heavy with gravity, "I need your names and badge numbers." The officers hesitated, exchanging glances, searching for their usual confidence and finding it missing. The shorter one cleared his throat. "We were conducting a routine stop, ma'am. There was a tail light issue. Also some unsecured items." She didn't blink. "And did the routine stop involve scattering a veteran's personal property on the roadside and damaging a gift meant for a family member?" The taller deputy stiffened slightly, jaw-setting. "Ma'am, we were following department procedures. There was cause to inspect." "Did you ask for consent?" she asked, voice sharper now, like a blade pressed flat instead of a point. "Did you verify your claim before escalating?" He hesitated. "It's not standard to request consent when there's visible probable cause." She stepped forward just enough to close the distance. Visible probable cause, deputy, is not a substitute for protocol. And disrespect is not policy. Walter placed a hand lightly on her arm. "Camille," he said, low, steady, "it's done now." But she shook her head, not in defiance but in resolve. "No, Dad, it's not. Not this time." She pulled out her phone, not the one linked to her private life, but the one reserved for official briefings and secured communication. She lifted it with methodical grace and began taking photographs, first of the bench, the broken leg, the dented toolbox, the medals resting in gravel. Then of the officers who had now frozen in awkward stillness, their earlier authority shriveling under the weight of unintended consequence. The onlookers, still quiet now, pulled their phones too. The teenager behind the fence was still recording his camera phone, trembling slightly, as if even he understood something irreversible was unfolding before his eyes. Camille turned to the crowd, her tone still formal but edged with something deeply personal. "This man is my father. He served this country when it barely acknowledged him. He built a life here with patience, with honesty, and with quiet grace. And today he was humiliated not because he broke a law, but because he fits a profile." The silence that followed was complete, not because no one wanted to speak, but because there was nothing left to say. The senior officer finally spoke. "Ma'am, I'm sure we can resolve this with—" But Camille cut him off. "You will not resolve this. You will document this, and then you will wait. Internal Affairs will be contacted, your body cam footage requested, and this stop will be reviewed." The driver of the black SUV approached quietly from behind, leaning close to Camille's ear. "Ma'am, we're ready to depart when you are." She nodded once, then turned back to her father. "Let me help you load what's left." Together they gathered the tools again, not in silence, but in shared understanding. She handed him a wrench without a word, and he placed it carefully back in its place. The bench leg was gently wrapped in the same cloth he'd used that morning, now smeared with dust but still intact. They moved with the rhythm of people who had done hard things before and would do them again if necessary. When everything was back in place, she turned to him, her voice softer now. "You sure you're all right?" He nodded slowly. "You didn't have to come, Camille." "Yes," she said, eyes never leaving his. "I did." Then she stepped away back toward the SUV, pausing only once at the edge of the gravel to take one last look. Not at the deputies, not at the crowd, but at her father, standing beside his truck like a man who had weathered far worse and would, if needed, weather this too. And as she climbed into the vehicle and the door closed behind her, Camille Jenkins knew with complete certainty some battles are not chosen but inherited, and some moments quiet, unannounced, almost overlooked become the turning point of something far greater than any of us can see. General Camille Jenkins didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for rank or title, and didn't need to. The simple force of her presence had already peeled the confidence off the deputies, like heat-lifting paint from a scorched wall, leaving them blinking in the daylight, suddenly aware that this stop, this routine act they'd done 100 times without question, had shifted beneath them into unfamiliar terrain. Their training hadn't prepared them for this kind of scrutiny, the kind that came from someone who had stared down foreign generals and congressional panels alike, someone who knew not only how the system was supposed to work, but how easily it could be bent to serve the powerful and punish the quiet. Camille moved through the scene with measured control, her boots barely making a sound in the gravel as she circled the truck, her eyes recording everything: scratches on the tailgate, footprints near the toolbox, a torn photo in the dirt that she recognized instantly as the one her father kept of him and her mother on their anniversary, taken long before her stars were earned, and long before he needed to press a button to call for help. She knelt and retrieved it gently, brushing the dust away with her thumb, folding it once with care, and sliding it into the breast pocket of her uniform. Her father didn't speak. He didn't have to. She felt the weight of his silence in her spine. The officers tried to recover their footing. The taller one, Barnes, based on the stitched nameplate she hadn't needed to read, took a step forward, shoulders squared but breath just a little too shallow. "There's no need to escalate this, ma'am," he said, voice thinly veiled behind professionalism. "I'm sure we can sort everything out through the proper channels." Camille's head tilted just slightly. "That's exactly what I intend to do." Barnes cleared his throat, glancing toward the gathering crowd, which had not dispersed, but instead thickened as word traveled through the town: text messages, social media posts, whispered updates across hardware stores and church steps. What had begun as quiet curiosity had become something else now: witness. It didn't matter if they knew who she was. It mattered that they saw what happened when someone stood up and said, "Enough." Behind her, one of her aides approached quietly, a man in civilian clothes with a military bearing too polished to be mistaken for anything else. He leaned in close, voice pitched for her alone. "Ma'am, the press has picked it up. There's a live stream spreading." She nodded without breaking her gaze from Barnes. "Good. Let them see it all." Then, turning to the entire group, officers' crowd, and the handful of civilians who had simply been driving by but now stood frozen near their vehicles, she raised her voice just enough to carry. "This is what it looks like when a citizen is treated as a suspect for daring to drive a truck that doesn't shine. When a war veteran's medals are dumped into the dirt like forgotten tokens. When property is destroyed because its owner doesn't look like he belongs on this side of the county line." There was no anger in her tone, only clarity. It landed harder than shouting ever could. One of the younger officers, who hadn't spoken before, took a step back, his eyes darting to the body camera on his chest, as if suddenly wondering whether it had caught everything and whether it would be reviewed by someone who cared. Camille looked down at the citations crumpled in her father's hand. "Let me see those," she said gently. Walter handed them over without a word. She examined each one, reading them as if they were part of a tactical briefing, parsing the language for its underlying intent. "Obstruction?" she asked aloud, raising an eyebrow. For asking a question, she read another. "Unsecured load." For a hand-wrapped bench tied with 2 layers of rope and a veteran's care, and then with a calm precision that felt more like a courtroom than a roadside, she tore the citations in half, once, then twice, and let the pieces fall to the gravel at her feet. Barnes flinched, but she didn't look at him again. Instead, she turned to her father. "We're done here. Let's go home." Walter hesitated, glancing down at the mess at the broken bench, still awkward in the truck bed, at the tools waiting to be sorted and placed back in their proper order. Camille followed his gaze, then wordlessly stepped past him, lifting the smaller toolbox with one hand and beginning to gather what he had dropped, placing each item back where it belonged. He joined her a moment later, and together father and daughter moved like craftsmen, rebuilding what had been taken apart without care, quiet, methodical, side by side in the dust. The crowd watched, not speaking, not intruding, and yet something unspoken passed through them, a kind of reverence for the quiet way dignity reasserts itself, not with spectacle but with steady hands and shared work. When they were done, Camille lifted the broken bench leg and studied it for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the splinter, the initials W and L still visible beneath the crack. She placed it carefully back on the bench, wrapping it again in the cloth her father had used, tying it with a gentle knot. Then she turned back to the deputies one last time. "I expect a full report filed with your department within 24 hours, she said. You may also expect a formal complaint to your Internal Affairs Division, a federal civil rights inquiry, and a request for all body camera footage pertaining to this stop. I strongly recommend that no footage be altered, edited, or lost. I assure you I will know." The younger officers nodded quickly, visibly rattled, but Barnes held his expression neutral, only his jaw twitching slightly. Camille watched him for a long moment, then spoke one final time. "You've been doing this a long time, Officer Barnes. That's clear. But what's also clear is that the time for doing it this way is over." She didn't wait for a reply. Turning back to Walter, she gestured toward the passenger side of the truck. "Let me drive." He gave her a look, one part pride, one part reluctance, then nodded once. "Just don't strip the clutch," he muttered. Camille smiled for the first time all day, just barely, but it was real. As she settled into the driver's seat, and her father climbed in beside her, the engine rumbled to life with its familiar loyal grumble. The truck eased back onto the road like it had something left to prove, rolling past the stunned deputies, the silent crowd, and the open sky that stretched wide and waiting. And as the dust kicked up behind them, hanging in the air like the residue of something finally broken, Camille gripped the wheel firmly and said almost to herself, "Let them write their reports. I've already started mine." The flight home was quiet, not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows a loud crash when dust still hangs in the air and everyone's waiting to see what's broken and what can be salvaged. General Camille Jenkins sat in the back of the unmarked SUV, rolling along the highway, her posture unchanged, but her thoughts moving like wildfire, sparking connections between glances, actions, phrases that hadn't seemed important until she'd seen them together in that dusty roadside tableau. Her father hadn't said much since they left the scene, just a few remarks about the way the bench had cracked or how the roads had gotten rougher over the years, but she could feel his unease tight in his shoulders, quiet in his breath too. Many things unsaid, not because he was hiding anything but because the years had taught him. It didn't matter who heard. But Camille had learned to listen differently, not just to words but to patterns. And as they pulled into the driveway of the house, she grew up in a single-story brick home with a front porch sagging just slightly on one side. She knew the stop that morning hadn't been random. It hadn't been about a taillight or a truck bed or a miscommunication. It was part of something wider, deeper, and older than that. Something her father had endured quietly for years, and that she, in uniform and command, had somehow managed to miss until now. Inside the house, she sat at the dining table while Walter boiled water for coffee like he always did, slow and exact measuring grounds by feel rather than spoon. She watched him move through the kitchen, steady, quiet, careful, not to slam a cabinet or rattle a dish, and something about the ritual struck her as unbearably fragile, like watching someone build a fence in a flood. "When was the last time you were pulled over before today?" she asked, finally, voice low. Walter glanced up, then down again. "Last month. And before that, maybe in January. Same road, different faces." She nodded, absorbing that, running the math in her head. "Did you report it?" He shook his head once. "Report to who?" That answer hit harder than it should have, but she didn't argue with it. She knew the weight behind those 4 words, the futility, the quiet resignation, the long memory of doors closed and phones unanswered. "I need to see your citations," she said. "All of them." He gestured toward a drawer beside the fridge. "Top left, rubber band around them." She opened it and pulled out a small stack of folded papers, each creased and worn from being handled, some with faint fingerprints in oil or dust, none torn, none thrown away. She spread them across the table, her military mind immediately cataloging them. Dates, locations, reasons, badge numbers, tail light, turn signal, rolling stop, unsafe load, window tint, license frame. Each one small on its own, but together they painted something unmistakable, a pattern not of law enforcement but of targeting. She didn't speak for several minutes, just ran her fingers over the ink, the signatures, the language that had been designed to sound neutral but landed like a sentence anyway. Across from her, Walter sat quietly, hands folded on the table. "You see it now, don't you?" he asked, not accusing, not bitter, just tired. "I see it," she said without looking up. "And I'm not the only one who needs to." That night, back at her temporary office in the city, she requested a confidential pull of traffic stop data from the past 2 years in Mapleton County, filtered by race, age, and zip code. The numbers came in by midnight, and they confirmed what she already knew in her gut. Black drivers were stopped nearly 3 times more often than white drivers, and of those nearly half were elderly or retired. The violations were minor technicalities, things most departments would issue a warning for. But in Mapleton they became revenue and control. She forwarded the data to Major Chen, one of her most trusted intelligence officers, and asked her to begin compiling complaint records from the same region. At the same time, Camille reached out to an old contact at the Department of Justice, someone who'd worked civil rights investigations in the South and who didn't flinch at the word pattern. The conversation was short but productive. Files would be opened, analysts assigned, discretion guaranteed. By morning, Camille had moved from anger to focus. Her emotions were still there, coiled beneath the surface, but now they had formed direction and urgency. She called a meeting with her legal team, her data specialists, and the quiet colonel who handled sensitive outreach. One by one, she laid out what they were dealing with, not just over-policing, but a systemic practice that appeared to exist for the purpose of intimidation, revenue, extraction, and land pressure. Land pressure, one of her aides repeated, confused. She nodded. Look at where the citations cluster. Now overlay that with the proposed development zones the county approved last year. See it? There was silence as the maps aligned. One aide murmured, "They're choking these neighborhoods street by street." Camille nodded again. It's not just harassment, it's displacement. That was the moment the room shifted. No longer just about a traffic stop or even a father's humiliation, it was about property, about leverage, about an invisible system functioning exactly as designed to push certain families off their land while offering nothing in return but fines, warnings, and broken dignity. As the team dispersed to begin compiling a formal case, Camille sat alone for a moment, staring at a single citation from her father's drawer. The handwriting was rushed sloppy. The ink had bled slightly at the edge, as if it had been filled out on a cruiser hood. The reason for stop read, equipment defect. The description said, rear lamp partially obstructed. She thought of that bench in the back of the truck, hand-built, wrapped in care, a gift for a grave, and how someone had looked at it and seen nothing more than an excuse. She folded the citation carefully and placed it into her folder, not as evidence but as reminder. When she left the building that evening, the city was bathed in amber light traffic, low air thick with coming rain. She stopped beside her car and looked up at the sky where clouds curled like something uncertain, something waiting. The storm wasn't here yet, but it was close. And as she stood there, listening to the wind whistle through the parking lot, she thought not about war or tactics or courts. She thought about her father alone on that road, holding a broken bench in one hand and his pride in the other. And she knew without question that this fight was no longer one she could walk away from. The first message came through an encrypted inbox, Camille rarely used anymore, one that only a handful of people even remembered existed, mostly contacts from earlier days before she wore 4 stars when information moved in whispers and names were guarded like secrets. It was unsigned, the subject line empty, the body just 2 lines long, asterisk. He's not the only one. We need to talk. I kept everything. Asterisk. Attached was a single audio file, 10 seconds in length, filled with background radio static, a voice half-muted by distance, and a name spoken clearly, Officer Barnes. Camille leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment, listening to the clip again with the headphones pressed against her temples. The voice was familiar, not Barnes himself, but someone speaking to him, calling him by name during what sounded like a routine stop. The tone was casual, indifferent, too calm for what she now understood had likely been a violation of procedure. She'd heard voices like that before, not just as a general but as a daughter who had watched her father be spoken to that same way, as if existence came with conditions. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed Major Diana Chen, who was still embedded in Mapleton under the pretense of conducting a research project on police-community relations. I got something, Camille said. Anonymous tip. Could be a trap, could be a lead. I want you to track down anything on an internal contact, someone who might have worked dispatch or records, someone who knows the system from the inside but hasn't been part of the public face. Chen didn't ask questions. Give me an hour. 47 minutes later, Camille's phone buzzed again. Her name is Nadine Clark, Chen said. 34 years with the department. Retired 6 months ago. Kept her head down, no complaints, no accolades. She lives alone outside of town. Small farmhouse, near the old rail line. Known for minding her own business. She didn't mind it today, Camille replied. Camille didn't send agents. She didn't deploy surveillance teams or schedule a formal debriefing. Instead, she got in a borrowed sedan, dressed down in plain clothes, and drove the 30 miles out to Clark's house herself. The road narrowed into a gravel path flanked by dry grass and fading mailboxes, the kind of place where nothing moves quickly and no one expects company. When she pulled up the porch, light flicked on before she'd even stepped out of the car. Clark met her at the door with a tired gaze and a cigarette burning low between two fingers. Her posture was firm but not defensive, like someone who'd decided a long time ago that the worst had already happened and everything else was just degrees of noise. "You came," she said, not surprised. "You called," Camille replied, stepping up onto the porch. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old wood and tobacco, with a single fan spinning slowly overhead and papers stacked in precise rows on a dining room table that hadn't seen a meal in months. Nadine gestured for her to sit, and then reached for a shoebox resting beneath the table. It was unmarked, its cardboard edges worn soft, the lid covered in faint scuff lines like it had been slid back and forth across that table more times than it should have. "I logged everything," Nadine said, her voice gravelly from smoke and age but steady. "Not just calls, timestamps, patrol assignments, complaint filings, even the ones that got deleted from the system, especially those." She opened the box and pulled out a series of USB drives, each labeled by year. "I didn't know what to do with it at first. Figured maybe someone would ask the right question eventually. They never did." Camille picked up one of the drives, turning it over in her hand. "Why now?" Nadine looked at her for a long time, her gaze direct. "Because they went too far. That man, your father, he didn't just get stopped, he got humiliated. That wasn't about enforcement. That was about reminding him where they think he belongs." Camille swallowed the burn rising in her throat. "He's been stopped before. He didn't tell me." "Of course he didn't," Nadine said quietly. "Men like him don't. They carry it like a weight they don't want their children to feel." The room went quiet again, the fan clicking softly above them, and Camille felt the gravity of that truth settle into her bones. Not rage, not grief, something older, more resigned. "I've seen the patterns," Camille said, running her fingers across the edge of a printed log Nadine had laid out. "But this confirms intent. Targeted stops, manufactured citations, suppressed complaints, and it goes higher than the officers," Nadine added. "Barnes doesn't do anything unless he knows someone's watching his back." "Who?" Camille asked. "I can't prove it yet," she said. "But I can show you where to look." They sat for another hour, going through logs, identifying dates that coincided with land transfers meetings between county officials, calls routed through private numbers tied to development firms. Camille recognized from past briefings. This wasn't just bias, this was business. As the night deepened, Nadine stood and walked to the window, watching the tree line sway in the wind. "You're going to stir up a mess," she said without turning around. "They don't like when outsiders shine lights in their dark corners." Camille joined her, folding her arms. "I'm not an outsider." Nadine smiled faintly. "Number. You're the reckoning they didn't think was coming." When Camille finally stood to leave, Nadine handed her a final envelope. "This one's personal. It's your father's name in the logs. 3 stops not on record, all with the same patrol car, same badge number. They never filed paperwork, just kept the pressure up." Camille tucked the envelope into her coat, then paused at the door. "You've done more than most ever will. Thank you." Nadine shook her head. "Don't thank me until it matters." Back in the car with the shoebox seatbelted in beside her like precious cargo, Camille didn't start the engine right away. She sat there, hands on the wheel, the moonlight spilling across the windshield, the sound of insects pressing against the night in steady rhythm. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt aligned. As if the long string of moments, each one seemingly isolated, had finally snapped into place, revealing the outline of something undeniable. And as the wind moved through the fields beyond the road, she knew this wasn't just a collection of files. This was the first real crack in a wall that had been standing too long. The courthouse smelled like old paper and floor wax, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the kind of soft hum that people stop hearing after too many years under them. General Camille Jenkins stood at the front of the narrow meeting room, a place normally reserved for zoning disputes and water board hearings now transformed, if only for an hour, into a makeshift war room. The air conditioning was weak, the chairs were mismatched, and yet every seat was filled, not by politicians or press, but by people who had quietly carried the weight of injustice on their backs for too long without anyone listening. Beside her, Sergeant Thomas Hayes placed a thin manila folder onto the folding table between them, his hand steady, but his jaw clenched in that way people do when they're holding something back. The contents inside weren't explosive on their own incident, reports, patrol logs, internal memos, but together they wove a picture that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just bias. It wasn't even just harassment. It was a deliberate framework built to punish and pressure, aimed at the same families again and again, until the land beneath their feet became too unstable to stand on. Camille didn't start with a speech. She started with silence. She let the room settle, let the reality of where they were and what they were doing take hold, let the weight of their stories fill the space before any words were spoken. She looked out at them, retirees with calloused hands, single mothers in nursing scrubs, young men with wary eyes who had already learned to speak softly to survive. People who had stopped believing anything would change and yet had shown up anyway, maybe because someone else had asked them to, or maybe because something inside them still hoped they were wrong. "There is a system here," she began, her voice low and even, "and it's not broken. It's working exactly the way it was built to." That sentence hung in the air like a flare in the dark. She continued drawing from the folder, holding up copies of records she had received from Nadine Clark, layered with the stop data her team had analyzed. One by one, she named the patterns: how black drivers accounted for 78% of all traffic citations in the county, despite making up less than a third of the population. How complaints filed against officers like Barnes vanished after reaching internal review. How the stops happened most often in areas where land had recently been appraised or rezoned for development. "They want you to think it's about law and order," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "But it's about control. It's about pressure. And it's about who they want to see pushed out of these neighborhoods when the blueprints for that resort get dusted off again." From the back of the room a voice spoke, not angry, not loud, just tired. "They did it to my brother," a woman said, standing slowly. 3 stops in 2 months, fined him into choosing between groceries and a lawyer. Now he's living in a trailer 3 towns over." Heads nodded all around her. Camille didn't interrupt. She let it unfold, let the silence do the work between the words. Another man spoke next, older, slow in his speech but sharp behind the eyes. "They kept citing me for overgrown grass," he said. "I cut it every Saturday, but that didn't matter. I got code violations until my taxes tripled, then a notice in the mail telling me I was behind, and next thing I know they're offering to buy the property." He held up a copy of the letter like a flag of surrender. Camille stepped forward carefully, placing a new document on the table, a map layered with enforcement data and land transfers. The evidence was now undeniable. When enforcement increased, so did property sales. When citations surged, appraisals dropped. When enough pressure mounted, the owners left. "They were never just policing your streets," she said. "They were clearing a path." Sergeant Hayes cleared his throat then and stepped beside her. He didn't speak like an officer addressing a crowd, but like a man confessing to his neighbors. "I tried to stop it from the inside," he said, his voice rough but sure. "I filed reports. I raised questions. I spoke up during briefings, and every time they told me to stop asking if I wanted to stay employed. But I didn't join the force to serve a spreadsheet or a developer's bottom line. I joined to serve people, my people." Camille placed a hand on his shoulder, not for show but for steadiness, for solidarity, for the cost she knew he was paying by standing there. From the corner of the room, a young woman in jeans and a worn hoodie raised her hand. "So what happens now?" she asked. Camille took a breath. "Now we organize, we file federal complaints, we request oversight, we push for transparency in every corner of city government, and we vote on school boards, on sheriffs, on mayors. Every inch of ground we've lost, we take it back. Not through noise, but through strategy." She looked at them, at the hands, gripping chairs, the furrowed brows, the tired but attentive faces, and saw something begin to shift. Not revolution, not anger, but the slow burn of recognition that they were no longer alone in what they'd seen. After the meeting ended, as chairs scraped and voices rose in cautious conversation, Camille stepped outside into the humid evening air. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and blue cicadas buzzing in the distance like static on a radio, and for the first time in weeks she let her shoulders drop slightly, just enough to feel the ache she'd been ignoring. Hayes joined her a moment later, holding a styrofoam cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. "You think they'll stick with this?" he asked. Camille turned to him, eyes steady. "They don't need to believe it'll work yet. They just need to believe it's worth trying." She walked toward her car, the courthouse glowing behind her like the last light in a small town that had waited too long for morning. And as she opened the door, a breath of warm air rushing out from the cab, she paused to look back one last time at the people still gathered inside, at the ones beginning to linger in the parking lot, swapping numbers and names. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was movement. And sometimes, movement is the first undeniable proof that the ground is no longer holding still. The porch smelled of sawdust and coffee, two scents that had defined Walter Jenkins's life more than most people ever realized, drifting through the screen door as the late afternoon sun filtered through a rustling canopy of oak trees. His hands, though slower now, still moved with the same intention they always had, measuring, sanding, fitting each piece of wood, like it was part of something older than furniture, something he couldn't quite name but never questioned. The workshop, rebuilt plank by plank with help from neighbors, old veterans, and volunteers who had shown up without being asked, had become more than a building. It had become a promise, kept to himself, to Lillian, and maybe even to a future he'd once doubted was possible. That morning, before anyone else arrived, Walter had swept the floors twice, not because they needed it, but because some habits weren't about results, they were about readiness. He checked every corner for loose nails, wiped the windows even though they'd fog again by dusk, and rearranged the chisels on the back wall until the layout felt right in his bones. When the kids began to arrive, high schoolers from both sides of town, a few with hands too soft for a hammer but hearts open to learn, he greeted each one with a nod, sometimes a short "Mornin'," never a lecture. He didn't need to explain what the space meant. They felt it in the quiet rhythm of his work, the way he showed by doing, not telling. Camille stood at the edge of the yard, watching from under the brim of her cap, arms crossed loosely, not in judgment but in quiet observation. She had seen her father command a room without raising his voice, lead by example, without knowing that's what it was. And this moment, this porch, these kids, this humble structure filled with the sound of hammers and shared effort meant more to her than any ceremony she'd ever saluted. In all her years in uniform, from desert deployments to Capitol Hill, she had never seen leadership look quite like this. "Think they know what he's teaching them?" asked Darnell Williams, the new sheriff, stepping up beside her with a coffee in hand, dressed down in jeans and a county-issued polo, a man still earning the community's trust day by day. "Not yet," Camille said, her voice warm but weighted. "But one day they'll be fixing something, maybe a door, maybe a problem, and they'll hear his voice in the back of their mind telling them to sand with the grain." Williams smiled, then turned serious. "You know, we couldn't have cleaned that department out without you. Or him." Camille shook her head gently. "You could have. It just might have taken longer, and it might have cost more people their peace." Inside the workshop, a girl dropped a board with a loud bang and apologized instinctively. Walter waved it off with a dry chuckle. "You're not building for angels," he said. "Mistakes just give the piece a story." The room laughed softly, and Camille felt a quiet swell in her chest, pride not just in him, but in what had grown from the wreckage. The investigation had been hard, bitter, and at times ugly. Arrests had been made, records unsealed, and a federal spotlight had cast its harsh glow on every corner of Mapleton's power structure. But change had come not just from the top down, but from the ground up, from whistleblowers like Nadine, from officers like Hayes and Rodriguez, from every citizen who showed up to vote when they never had before. The department was under new leadership now, with oversight that actually meant something and policies built on accountability instead of fear. Former allies of the corrupt sheriff had either resigned or been removed, their silence replaced by community boards that met monthly in spaces that welcomed open chairs and open mouths. Body camera footage was reviewed regularly, not buried. And more importantly, people had started waving again on sidewalks, across fences, inside coffee shops, because they finally believed their presence mattered. Walter stepped out of the workshop, then wiping his hands on a rag, and looked out across the yard at his daughter. He smiled, not wide, not flashy, but the kind of smile that says, "I see you, and I'm proud, even if I don't say it out loud." Asterisk. She walked toward him, and he met her halfway. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the tall grass, just watching the kids file out, chatting, as they slung backpacks over shoulders and high-fived one another like something good had happened, and they knew it, even if they didn't quite understand why. "You got something here," Camille said, glancing back at the workshop. "It's not mine anymore," Walter replied, his eyes following the last student down the gravel path. It belongs to whoever's willing to listen." They stood in silence for a while, just breathing in the smell of fresh-cut lumber and late summer earth. Then Walter reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded photo, creased, weathered, but still clear. It was the picture of Lillian on the original bench, her head tilted back in laughter, the porch sunlight painting lines across her face like brushstrokes. "I built that bench for her birthday," he said, his voice low and steady. "Never thought it'd be what broke me open." Camille looked at the photo, then back at her father. "It didn't break you," she said softly. "It uncovered you." He didn't reply right away, just nodded once and tucked the photo away. Maybe so. A breeze moved through the trees, then rustling the leaves just enough to scatter a few across the grass. The kind of movement that doesn't ask for attention but earns it anyway. Camille glanced up at the sky, cloudless now, the sun leaning low but not heavy. There was light in it, a kind of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm thinking of retiring," she said, suddenly catching even herself by surprise. Walter turned to her, eyebrows raised slightly. "You sure?" She smiled, then shrugged. "I want to do something that builds instead of dismantles. Something slower. Something that lasts longer than a headline." He grinned faintly, eyes twinkling. "You gonna open your own shop?" "Maybe," she said. "But I'll start by sanding with the grain." They both laughed, and for a moment the weight of the past year didn't disappear, but it did settle like dust, finding a home after being shaken loose. The porch creaked gently beneath them as they sat down side by side, watching the last light stretch across the grass. No more sirens, no more speeches. Just two people who had weathered the storm, still standing, still building, still believing that even splintered things could be made whole again. And as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch, neither of them said another word. They didn't have to. The quiet said enough. Sometimes, what changes an entire community isn't something grand or someone powerful standing at the top. It begins with the quiet persistence of an ordinary person, like a father who refuses to back down in the face of injustice, daughter who chooses to speak out at exactly the right moment. Walter Jenkins' story isn't just about an old truck or a broken bench. It's a powerful reminder that dignity, justice, and respect should never depend on skin color, rank, or social status. Values like patience, kindness, and a commitment to community things older generations have always cherished still hold deep meaning in a world that's changing every day. And sometimes one right action, one steady voice is all it takes to inspire an entire generation. If you've ever felt like you're too small to make a difference, remember this: it's the quiet strength, the everyday courage, and the steady heart that truly build something lasting. If this message resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes in standing up for what's right, no matter their age.